days worth of wages to pay for whatever the wounded man needed. The Samaritan said, I'm going to roll back through here in a couple of days and I'll reimburse you for any extra expense you may have in caring for the wounded one that I'm leaving here to get well. Then Jesus asked the expert in the law, which one of the three was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? And the expert in the law had to say, the one who had mercy on him. The law said Samaritans were untouchable. The law said Samaritans were unclean. The law said Samaritans and Jews could not touch one another, eat out of the same dishes, drink out of the same cups, or use the same spoons to ladle out water or ladle out noodles. But Jesus' deep answer teaches us that what the law says and what the Lord requires are sometimes two very different things.
Come on now.
Several times at this conference this week, what does the Lord require? To do justly, to love mercy. The one who shows mercy. Who is my neighbor? The text teaches me that my neighbor, number one, is the very one I detest. Jews couldn't stand Samaritans. And Samaritans didn't care too much about Jews either. One chapter back in Luke 9, verses 52 and 53, Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem to do for us what we could not do for ourselves. He sent some messengers ahead to a Samaritan village to get things ready for him as they passed through, and the Samaritans did not welcome him. They said in so many words, not here, Junior. Not here, Jerusalem Jew. Not here, G. No. James and John wanted to call down fire from heaven to destroy the village because of the way they had treated and mistreated their master. But Jesus rebuked James and John. He said in so many words, you all are out for revenge. I'm all about redemption, restoration, and renewal. Have you forgotten my life-changing conversation with a Samaritan woman by the well of Jacob in Sychar? God sent not his son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. The world includes Samaritans. Who is my neighbor? The text says my neighbor is the very one I detest. The text also says my neighbor is the very one I have been taught to hate. Jews have been taught to hate Samaritans. Ever since the death of King Solomon and Jeroboam made Samaria the capital of Israel, the 10 tribes in the northern kingdom, the Jews of Judea, the Jews of Judah, along with that other small tribe, Dr. Frederick Williams talked about the tribe of Benjamin in the southern kingdom, they had been taught that Jerusalem was the center of Judaism, and that the other folk worshiping at Bethel, the house of God in the northern kingdom, had it all wrong. Now that is the biblical background for that theological discussion the Samaritan woman at the well in John 4 tried to drag Jesus into. With her, she came up with a test question. Well, where are we supposed to worship? My people say Samaria and Bethel, the house of God. Your people say Jerusalem, where the temple of Solomon is. Another test question in an attempt to deflect the attention away from the real issue. Jesus cut straight to the chase. He said, where your husband? Go get your husband. You out here at noon getting water all by yourself instead of coming early in the morning or at supper time when the other women come, because other folk diss you. But where other folk diss you, I want to disciple you. Go get your husband. Let's get to the crux of this matter and straighten that out. Peter, Andrew, James, John, Nathaniel, they were all shocked when they came back from the town of Sychar. Why? Because Jesus was talking to a woman of Samaria, a Samaritan woman. Jews had been taught to hate Samaritans, starting with the death of Solomon, exacerbated with the exile of the northern 10 tribes when the capital of Samaria fell in 722 BCE. They were carried away into captivity, and what the king did was he stopped Samaria and a bunch of half-breeds. They were considered mongrels by the Jews. Jews had been taught to hate half-breed Samaritans, and Jewish law had co-signed on that teaching. And here is Jesus saying, my neighbor is the very one I have been taught to hate. Now, most of you have not been to the Holy Land. You've not been to Israel. You have no idea where Samaria is. You couldn't find it on the map if I handed you a map right now. So let me come on out of Samaria. Let's come down to Savannah.
Come on now. Come on now.
Who have we been taught to hate? Us. Well, for white Christians, that's Negroes in Savannah.
Come on now.
For American Christians, that's the Mexicans. For most Christians, that's Muslim. Mispronounced Muslim. We don't know the difference between Shia, Sunni, Sufi, Hanafi. We just know them Taliban. Everybody run to see American sniper. Them wrapped up, got them Taliban. They call them sand niggas. We just hate them. For black Christians, who have you been taught to hate? Fill in your own blanks.
Come on now.
The poor, all the people who keep me from getting what I deserve. Who is my neighbor? The very one that I have been taught to hate. I call Jesus' answer to the deep question, who's my neighbor, even deeper, because his answer says, number one, my neighbor is the very one I detest. The one, number two, I've been taught to hate, the one I think I'm better than.
Come on now.
Look at the Lock-Carry footprint historically and contemporaneously. Then hold those two images up against your midwinter conversations. Start, if you want to, with Lock-Carry himself and the American Colonization Society in the 1820s. African Americans thought, because they were taught, that they were superior to, better than the indigenous people of Liberia, the Kru and the Grebo. Like those born in Judah in our text thought they were taught, because they were taught, that they were better than the people born in Samaria. In the 19th century, throughout the 20th century, and for far too many of us in the 21st century, African Americans taught, and some still think, that we're superior to and better than Africans on the continent. For a century and a half, that misguided, miseducated, dystopia, misshaped, and missiological perspective, as Brueggemann points out, taught that the dominant narrative that we were taught, we were brought into, we bought it hook, line, and sinker. We were taught that we were better than those people, and wrongfully equated European and British, or worse yet, American culture with Christianity. We preached Western culture to those uncivilized heathens. We preached our culture as synonymous with Christ. That is what the dominant narrative taught, and that is what far too many of us thought. Our proclamation in word and deed was not prophetic. It did not seek to interpret the words of, nor did it seek to interrupt the dominant narrative of Western culture. It bought into and went along with the dominant narrative. We didn't see them as our neighbor. We saw them as needy. They needed what we had. So we set out to make them over in our image, because after all, we were better than they were. And Jesus says, my neighbor is the very one the dominant narrative has taught me that I'm better than. Who is it that you've been taught you are better than tonight? That homeless brother?
Come on now.
Members of First African. I ain't gonna talk to the other folk. You pass that brother with the sign every time you come to church. We'll work for food. And some of y'all say, yeah, I work for food too. That who you think you better than that? Who you think you better than? That inmate? That junkie?
Come on now.
Top-head?
Come on now.
Who you think you better than?
Educate them.
Them folk that don't have command of the king or the queen's English as I do, or as Bill Cosby himself had, except when he was being Fat Albert. Hey, hey, hey. Is that who you think you better than?
Come on now.
Anybody got time for that? Is that who you think you got? Those filthy mouth hip hoppers who, when they ain't rapping to make money, cannot speak one sentence in English that makes any sense. You know what I'm saying? You know what I'm saying? Is that who you think you better than? Jesus said, my neighbor is the very one I detest, and the very one I've been taught to think that I am better than. Then Jesus says that my neighbor is the very one I have been taught to hate, especially folk outside my race.
Come on now.
Robert Sobukwe, a much maligned South African genius, not revered and adored like Mandela Madiba, the founder. Sobukwe was the founder of the Pan-African Congress that split off from the African National Congress. Robert Sobukwe, a man so powerful and so feared by the apartheid government that when he was captured and sent to Robben Island, he was not only in solitary confinement the entire time he was on the island, they put Sobukwe in a house all by himself and allowed him to have no human contact with anybody the entire time of his sentence.
That's right.
Well, Robert Sobukwe, Mangaliso Robert Sobukwe said this, quote, "There's only one race to which we all belong, and that is the human race. My neighbor," says Jesus, "is the very one I've been taught to hate outside of my socially constructed race." But then ultimately what the text says to me is, my neighbor is any human being made in the image of God, because all human beings are the children of God. Dr. Karen Baker Fletcher puts it this way, quote, she says, "We are called by God to love our neighbor, and that means to love beyond race, to love beyond class, to love beyond gender, to love beyond all manner of orientations, sexual orientations, or any other orientations. We are called by God to love beyond every kind of difference." And as some of you, in fact, Brother Mitchell just talked to me about it today, I've been teaching since the 1970s that being different does not make you deficient. It just means you're different. We are called by God to work, she says, as one creation for the well-being of all creation. And then she adds these words, "We are not called to judge one another. We are only called to hear and to discern the call of God, which is always the call to love God and to love our neighbor as we love ourselves." Who is my neighbor? My neighbor, says Jesus, is always the stranger or the strange one who has been struck down on the journey of life on this earth and in this cosmos, struck down existentially and struck down ontologically. Priest Jeremiah, I'm trying my best. The stranger is always the Samaritan, the one who is despised by the super holy, despised by the super righteous, despised by the super Christian. The stranger is the one who may be gay or lesbian, black or Appalachian, white, Hispanic or Asian, Syrian or Sudanese, Muslim or Buddhist, Pentecostal or Palestinian, or Palestinian Pentecostal. The stranger is the one who may be Jewish or Hindu, pagan or Christian, atheist or theist, agnostic or believer, high yellow, deep chocolate, straight hair, kinky hair, weaved hair, or no hair. My neighbor is the stranger who is a human being made in the image of God, because all human beings are made in the image of God and are children of God. Whether they believe what I believe or not, they are still a child of God. Whether they say what my megachurch pastor said, inerrant, infallible, they are still a child of God. Whether they are Palestinian Christian, Palestinian Muslim, or Palestinian Jew, they are still a child of God. Whether they look like me or not, they are still a child of God. Whether they are sanctified or practitioners of Santeria, they are still a child of God. Whether they are European or African, Asian or Iraqi, Iranian or Australian, they are still a child of God. Whether they are rich or poor, they are still a child of God. Whether it's a Dalit in India or a dropout in Indianapolis, they are still a child of God. Whether it's a Choco in Colombia or a chocolate farmer in Cote d'Ivoire, they are still a child of God. Whether they're Yamasee Indian in South Carolina or Yamacraw brother from across the street, they're still a child of God. Whether they're high or low, they are still a child of God. Whether they are educated or uneducated, they are still a child of God. Whether they are literate or illiterate, they are still a child of God. Whether they're living in a mansion or living on the streets of Savannah, they are still God's child, still made in the image of God, worthy of protection, respect, and unconditional love.